Esperamos. La primera conferencia del simposio es la conferencia magistral que nos impartirá el profesor John Harris. Él es director del Instituto de Ciencia, Ética e Innovación en la Universidad de Manchester y donde es profesor Lord Alliance de Bioética. El programa está la Welcome Trust, el cuerpo humano, alcances, límites y futuro. El Sir John Stockton, Premio Nobel de Medicina. Es coeditor en jefe del Journal of Medical Ethics y ha sido miembro de la Comisión de Genética Humana en el Reino Unido desde su creación en 1999. Ha publicado varios libros, recientemente publicó Clones, Genes e Inmortalidad, Bioética, un compendio de genética, filosofía y la revolución genética, otro libro sobre la clonación, que es precisamente sobre lo que nos va a hablar hoy, y su libro Mejorando la Evolución, que ha sido considerado como un libro de gran influencia por publicaciones como el Times de Londres. Es entonces el doctor Harris, el profesor Harris, es uno de los biologicistas más prestigiados y le agradecemos mucho el que haya aceptado venir a participar en este simposio con su conferencia magistral titulada On Cloning. John, thank you very much for accepting to come to visit us. I must say that the first time I knew your name was because of your book Enhancing Evolution, which I have enjoyed very, very much. So thank you very much, John, for being with us today.
Thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome. I am delighted to be here for effectively the first time in Mexico. I came once for one day when I was 17 years old, so I don't really count that, but it is really good to be here. I'd like to start by saying how deeply honored I am to have been invited to speak at this important celebration of 10 years of the College of Bioethics here in Mexico City. Particularly so because it cements an already existing collaboration between my university, the University of Manchester in the UK, and UNAM here in Mexico City. This collaboration has been recently recognized by the award of a project grant for us to collaborate from the British Academy, one of our national academies. And this grant will enable us to go on cooperating for 3 years from just about now. We're working out the initial phases almost as I speak. And the grant is to work on the ethics and policy dimensions of stem cell science and neuroscience. This collaboration is also signalled by the fact that we've been lucky enough in Manchester to attract some wonderful PhD students from Mexico. One of them, Maria Chiri Medina, is here with us, and she has been very important in facilitating this collaboration and in the work that led up to us getting this grant. So I'm very grateful to her for all of that. And another student from this university, Cesar Palacios, has just joined us in Manchester. So already I feel that I'm almost Mexican. Now, today, I want to talk to you about the interplay between science and society, about scientific freedom and social responsibility, but most of all, about the disastrous effects that misunderstandings of science can have. And I want to start on a rather cataclysmic note to try to emphasize why the misunderstanding of science can be absolutely vital. I want to tell you a truth about the future. Now, anybody who purports to tell truths about the future is treading on very dangerous ground, but I think this truth is as true as any truths about the future ever are. And that truth is that in the future there will be no more human beings and there will be no more planet Earth. Now, the question of whether that fact about the future should worry us or not will depend on how science manages to progress. Why will there be no more human beings? Well, because either we will have wiped ourselves out by our recklessness and irresponsibility, which includes, of course, climate change and very many other things, or, more hopefully, we will have further evolved into creatures more capable of surviving the hazards that will face us. But we know for sure that there will be no more planet Earth. The sun will eventually die, but long before that happens, the changes in the sun's temperature will have made the Earth uninhabitable. That will happen. There's some new work actually just published last week, which suggests that rather than this happening in 6 billion years, which is a comfortingly far enough time not to worry about too much, it's more likely to happen in about 3 billion years. Whether any of us in this room will be here when that happens will be an interesting question, but of course advances in longevity studies may mean that there are people in this room who might conceivably survive that long. However, what we must hope is that if when that day comes, we humans, or more likely, as I believe, our further evolved successors, will have had to improve our science and technology to the point where we can either find another planet to live on, or possibly even construct another planet to live on. So we depend on science, and therefore it matters crucially how science is perceived in the public. Now, in the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about cloning. But it teaches us some lessons about this rather apocalyptic theme that I've chosen to start with. The publication in the journal Cell on the 6th of May this year of the successful cloning of human embryonic stem cells has not only opened the way to new tissue-matched therapies, but has also reawakened a debate on the ethics of human reproductive cloning, which may prove, and this is why this work published in Cell this year has been so dramatically received, it may prove to be a safe enough byproduct of the techniques described by Militopov and his colleagues. The trick of this latest piece of cloning was apparently partly achieved by the judicious, difficult word to pronounce early in the morning, use of coffee. As Militopov said, by adding caffeine to cell cultures, their outputs were transformed. Quote, "We were able to produce one embryonic stem cell line using just 2 human eggs, which would make this approach practical for widespread use." As one of our major national newspapers in the UK, the London Observer, commented at the time, and I quote, "This announcement was also greeted with horror. Quote, scientists have finally delivered the baby that would-be human cloners have been waiting for. a method for reliably creating cloned human embryos, said David King of Human Genetics Alert. And he went on, "It is imperative we create an international ban on human cloning before any more research like this takes place. It is irresponsible in the extreme to have published this in Cell." And several of our tabloid newspapers, that's our less respectable newspapers, more dramatic newspapers, carried banner headlines warning of the human cloning danger. Of course, such reactions have a familiar ring. When Dolly the sheep was revealed in 1997, there was a similar hysterical, as I would call it, outpouring of objections. Now, David King's typically inflammatory suggestion seems to imply that science, which might save lives, must be put on hold despite the fact that what he fears might result, namely human reproductive cloning, is currently illegal in most countries, including in the United Kingdom. Now, one of the things I want to discuss a little bit more today is whether it is sensible or prudent that human reproductive cloning remains illegal. It's worth remembering in more detail the panic that greeted the birth of the redoubtable and much lamented Dolly on the 5th of July 1996. The reaction to Dolly's birth was quite unprecedented, I think. The then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, called immediately for an investigation into the ethics of such procedures and announced a moratorium on public spending on human cloning. In 2001, George W. Bush, of blessed memory, repeated this ritual hostility to cloning. And I quote him, "I strongly oppose human cloning, as do most Americans. We recoil at the idea of growing human beings for spare parts or creating life for our convenience." Members of the European Parliament demanded that each member state, which of course includes the UK, enact binding legislation prohibiting all research on human cloning and providing criminal sanctions for any breach. The European Parliament rushed through a resolution on cloning, which I'll quote to you in part. It said this: "The cloning of human beings cannot under any circumstances be justified or tolerated by any society, because it is a serious violation of the fundamental human rights and is contrary to the principle of equality of human beings." And it went on to explain why it thought it was contrary to this principle of equality. And it said, "As it permits a eugenic and racist selection of the human race, it offends against human dignity, and it requires experimentation on humans." Well, so there are lots of things that require experimentation on humans, and as for permitting a racist selection of the human race, well, nothing permits a racist selection of the human race more easily than sexual reproduction. It is common in many societies for people of similar races to mate with each other exclusively, and that often goes for religious groups and national groups as well. We don't need the help of biotech for us to be racist if we choose to be. One final quote: "The UNESCO International Bioethics Committee," I think there's a former member sitting in the second row here today, rushed out a resolution. Perhaps you were responsible for this, I don't know. Rushed out a resolution on the ethics of cloning. This demanded, and I quote, "the preservation of the human genome as the common heritage of humanity." And a number of equally misguided governments, as already noted, legislated against human cloning, including my own government, which passed a one-sentence act of parliament, a very rare thing, outlawing reproductive cloning. There should, it must be said, there were more sober reactions to Dolly's birth, but they were drowned in the torrent of panic and hyperbole. My own interest in cloning predates the birth of Dolly by some years. I first wrote about the ethics of cloning some 12 years before the birth of Dolly, and again immediately after her birth. That the hostility to the prospect of human reproductive cloning was almost immediately turned into legislation in many countries is, interestingly, a testament to the capacity of governments and of legislative mechanisms to respond quickly and effectively in an emergency, something that is often thought to be impossible. It is also testament to the power of irrationality over evidence-based appraisal. That these, as I see them, ridiculous laws, and I'll explain why in a few moments, remain enforced, seems to me to be an international scandal. There are interesting public policy lessons of many kinds to be learned from this episode, but I shall not try to spell them out further here. As Colin Blakemore, a professor of neuroscience at Oxford University, some of you may know his work. He was also director of our National Medical Research Council for many years, said at the time of this latest Cell publication, at the time, the chances of these horrors, that is the horrors that I read you right at the beginning, occurring when scientists had not even created a single clone of a single human cell were remote. That is the time of Dolly's birth. Not that this worried the alarmist. The crucial point is that we should have spent the intervening time, that is the time between the birth of Dolly in 1997 and the time between the publication of this paper in Cell this year, we should have spent the intervening time thinking about how we should react sensibly to the concept of a human clone when it does become possible. We have not done that, and although the science is still far off, it is getting closer. We need to ask carefully and calmly, under what circumstances would we tolerate the creation of a human clone? Now, despite the long time that has elapsed since the birth of Dolly, interest in this careful and calm examination has declined dramatically. Indeed, the decline started about the time of the publication of a book that I wrote on cloning in 2004. Imply no causal connection between those two events, but if you look on Google Trends, there are some lovely graphs actually tracing the decline in interest in the phenomenon of human cloning since the birth of Dolly, and it peaks around 2004, and then again the decline peaks if a decline can peak, and then it goes on going down. Now, I agree with Colin Blakemore that we need to think again about the ethics of cloning, and in what follows I'm going to do that for a few minutes. The debate about the ethics and policy of human reproductive cloning is in essence a debate about the merits or otherwise of degrees of genetic relatedness. This will be another theme of my talk today. And about the question of what it is to be or to remain human, and whether that's a good thing, and I shall comment on that as well. It is an irony seldom noted that humans tend to celebrate degrees of genetic relatedness in ascending order of closeness, with the notable exception of the big one, namely cloning. In other words, we like being genetically related to one another and tracing those relationships, right up until we have, as it were, complete identity of genetics, and then we find it horrifying. But I don't think we really find it horrifying, for the reasons that I'll now quickly go into. First, the claim that cloning is a threat to individuality. The European Parliament resolution on cloning claimed, as I've noted, each individual has a right to his or her own genetic identity, and that human cloning is and must continue to be prohibited. But there's no such thing as genetic identity. What nonsense. Or indeed, genetic individuality of persons. There is genetic identity and individuality of genomes, but that's something else. While except for clones and monozygotic siblings, there are small genetic variations between human individuals. Individuality is not simply that which individuates numerically or spatio-temporally, but that which differentiates historically, psychologically, and socially. It is a psychosocial concept, individuality, not a biological one, at least human individuality as it is used. It is a property of persons, beings with personality traits, with hopes, with fears, expectations, and desires, with a history. Features which make them more than living things with a genome, but persons with a distinct personality. Individuality is what makes us identifiable as ourselves, what you and I have. That which would identify us to those who know us as persons. It is not a function of our genes. Those who think genetic identity is a question of lineage, a term that geneticists use, lineage of origins, tend to link genetic identity with information about or knowledge of their progenitors. These people tend to talk of a right to know one's genetic identity or a right to know one's genetic origins. And they tend, for example, to deny any claims to anonymity by sperm donors and other forms of genetic parenting. But the right to knowledge of this sort is a very dangerous claim to make. If there really were to be such a thing as a right to knowledge of your progenitors, that would imply universal paternity testing. And any society that wants to go down that road is close to being insane, it seems to me. Just a reminder, non-paternity, that is to say, children who are not the children of the person they believe to be their father and who possibly believe also that he is their father, is a very common phenomenon. Not only in the United Kingdom, I venture to suggest, but the figures that I'm going to produce now are from the United Kingdom. Non-paternity rates are quoted with wildly differing values, from less than 1% of the population to more than 30%. A modest and probably reliable figure is about 2%. However, even at a modest rate of 2%, non-paternity rates in my country, in the UK, account for nearly 13,000 births annually to men who are not in fact the genetic father of the children that believe him to be their father and that he believes to be. Thus, if there is such a thing as a need for children to know their genetic background and true identity, then on the grounds of numbers alone, we should start with normal families, if there is such a thing as a normal family. This might imply an obligation for paternity testing in all families, and the mischief and disruption this would cause is clearly incalculable. It's hard to believe there is any such thing as a right to know one's genetic origins, but if there is, it is doubtful that the arguments which might sustain it are such as to outweigh the rights of privacy of sperm donors, of families, and still less the general protection of children. Interestingly, an entitlement to complete knowledge and the desirability to complete genetic knowledge of ourselves might imply that we should use human reproductive cloning as the preferred method of reproduction. Because what better way to get you up to know the meaning of your own genome than to have another example of it in front of you? It's said that it is only cloning that preserves the human genome. This was what was in the UNESCO declaration, but this is nonsense. In fact, sorry, that was an infelicity of expression. When we're thinking about what preserves the human clone, in fact, it is only cloning, or preserves the human genome. It's only cloning that does that. All other forms of reproduction vary the genome. It's only cloning that preserves it. And that shows that actually UNESCO was talking nonsense when they talked about the preservation of the human genome. They didn't mean that. They meant the preservation of an infinitely variable genome. But all forms of reproduction except cloning fail, in fact, to reproduce. It's only cloning that actually reproduces. All the others vary. And of course, sexual reproduction not only varies the genome, but produces all sorts of problems. It produces mutations, it produces repeat genetic diseases and so on. I was saying yesterday in a different paper to a different audience that the figures for human reproduction are there is an 80% failure rate. 80% failure rate in sexual reproduction. Who would go in for it? That means that every one of you sitting in this room is sitting here over the dead body, so to speak, of about 3 to 5 of your siblings who were conceived by your mothers and were probably washed out in the first menstrual cycle unnoticed by your mothers and unknown to you. But those are the facts. Getting new human beings costs embryos. There is no embryo risk-free way of reproducing. And of course, sexual reproduction also has an between 6 and 8% rate of serious genetic abnormality, and I'll come back to what that means in a moment. So, sex preserves a varied genome, but often at high costs. The cost is that sexual reproduction has been aptly called genetic roulette. You don't know what the results of the combination of 2 sets of chromosomes are actually going to be. Whereas with cloning, you have the opportunity of what I have called the creation of a tried and tested genome. If you're really worried about the genetic health of your offspring, or the children that you are going to rear, what you should do is use, if it's safe enough, and I'll come back onto that, you should use reproductive cloning. Because you can then get hold of a tried and tested genome, a genome that's had a healthy life for 60 or 70 years, and clone from that. Won't make the child less of an individual. It'll still be formed by you, the parents, and very different circumstances. But you will have much more reliability of genetic health than if you go in for genetic roulette. So if we're really interested in the safety aspects, cloning is a serious contender. The other thing to remember about cloning is that it is a reproductive modality with which we humans have vast and successful experience. Identical twins, as you all know, are clones. In fact, they are closer clones than any clones that would be produced by the Dolly method would be. Why? Because identical twins share a uterine environment, they are created at roughly the same time, they grow up in the same time zone, if you like, with the same people, whereas clones would not. Or at least most clones would not. So, not only is God or nature, whichever you prefer to worship, or neither, not only is God or nature a serial cloner, it is a reproductive modality which has been very successful. One in every 270 births, 3 per 1,000, are identical twins. Millions of identical twins. There are probably 1 or 2 in this room today. Millions of clones are walking the earth. Have the heavens fallen? I don't think so. Another interesting fact about monozygotic twinning and the cloning rate is that we know that in vitro fertilization, the procedure pioneered by Edwards and Steptoe, and which gave birth to Louise Brown many, many years ago, has now become a fairly universal practice. There are over 5 million children walking the earth today that were born as a result of IVF. But IVF dramatically increases the twinning rate by about a factor of 5. So those who are against cloning should be against in vitro fertilization on the grounds that it creates more clones than nature would create. But I don't think anybody has thought that this is a horrific byproduct of the wonderful success in treating infertility heralded by Edwards and Steptoe, for which Bob Edwards belatedly received the Nobel Prize last year. One thing, right, we are almost at the end of a sort of defense of cloning. One thing we should bear in mind is that safe cloning, if and when it can be safe, would avoid the dangers, as I've suggested, of the sexual lottery. Just to go into that figure that I mentioned to you earlier, a 6% abnormality rate, it doesn't sound a lot. But if you cash that out globally, every year an estimated 7.9 million children, that's at the rate of 6% of total births worldwide, are born with a serious birth defect of genetic or partially genetic origin. I'm very fond of reminding people that with its 80% failure rate and its 6% abnormality rate, if sexual reproduction had been invented as a reproductive technology rather than found as part of our evolved biology, it would never have got a license anywhere. Far too reckless and too dangerous. I now want to tell you a little story. I don't know, is this talk being recorded? Because I want to move away from the microphone.
Yes, it's been recorded, yes.
But anyway, I'm going to move away from the microphone to tell you a little story which I'm fond of telling. Not my story, it's a wonderful story told by Richard Dawkins in an essay called Gaps in the Mind. Have any of you read this essay?
No.
At least one person nodding. Anyway, I'll tell you the meat of the story. Richard Dawkins asks us to imagine, can you all still hear me? Yeah. He asks us to imagine a contemporary human woman standing on the coast of Africa looking north. There's Europe, Mexico's over there somewhere. West is there, east is there, standing on the west coast of Africa. And in her hand, she is holding the hand of her mother. And in her mother's right hand, she is holding the hand of her mother. And so on in an imaginary human chain, stretching into the continent of Africa. Every woman takes up about a meter of space, about a yard of space. And somewhere along, and each woman, each mother and daughter look as much like mothers and daughters as mothers and daughters usually do. But in about 300 miles, nearly 600 kilometers into Africa, this human chain, we come to our common ape ancestor. And our common ape ancestor is holding in her right hand her daughter, and so by line back to the coast, until we have on the coast of Africa a contemporary human woman looking at a contemporary chimpanzee. Because we and chimpanzees share a common ape ancestor. Now, we're not descended from chimpanzees, we're descended from an ape ancestor, and so are chimpanzees. And in that line of descent, as those of you who've studied these things will know better than I, there were apes that we humans did and could have reproduced with sexually. We are able to think of ourselves as a separate species in the sense that we humans can sexually reproduce with each other, but with no other species. We tend to think of that as a sort of tremendously important fact about evolution. The apes that we could and did in the past reproduce with have all died out. Now, what does this story tell us? It seems to me to tell us something quite interesting about our situation. And it is this, that not only does it remind us of our evolutionary history, not only does it remind us that in about the 7 million years that it took that 300-mile chain to get to wonderful creatures like you and I, very dramatic physical, biological changes have taken place to us. But it also reminds us that it's not necessarily a good idea to put an end to evolution. Imagine if our ape ancestors had got together on the plains of Africa 7 million years ago, 300 miles that way, and had said, simian nature, guys, great thing. We've got to preserve it like UNESCO wants us to preserve it at all costs. Well, if our simian ancestors had done that, and if they had been influential, as UNESCO doubtless are, and had persuaded governments to legislate against further deliberate changes in human evolution, then you and I would not be having this delightful conversation in